The film opens with a team of explorers in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. On their ship is a weather officer named David, responsible for monitoring atmospheric conditions. They are heading toward a remote island situated in the heart of the ocean. The government has stationed David there to observe the island's shifting weather patterns. His mission is to stay for 1 full year, collecting meteorological data before returning home. David has been provided with a year's worth of food and all the necessary supplies for his stay. After several days at sea, they finally reach the island. It is completely desolate, not a single soul or even a bird in sight. The only structures on the island are a lighthouse and a small cabin where David is supposed to live. Before David, another weather officer named Robert had been stationed there. However, when the team enters the cabin, they are struck with shock. There is no sign of Robert anywhere. The previous officer's belongings are scattered all over the room, leaving the place in total disarray. Following this, the captain and David figured there might be someone at the lighthouse. Without wasting a moment, they headed toward it, only to be met with a bizarre sight. The entire lighthouse was surrounded by sharp, jagged wooden stakes, as if someone had intentionally barricaded it to keep everyone out. The captain and David knocked on the door several times, but there was no response. Finally, they shoved the door open and forced their way inside. There, they found a man named Gruner. When they questioned Gruner about the previous weather officer, Robert, he coldly replied that the man was dead. He claimed Robert had headed toward the sea one day and never returned. David and the captain were stunned by his words. Sensing something was wrong, the captain turned to David and said, "If you want, you can still turn back and come with us." But David refused to leave. He was thinking about the payout. If he could provide the government with an accurate weather report from this island, he would earn a massive fortune. Before departing, the captain handed David a gun for protection. "This place doesn't feel safe to me," the captain warned. "Take care of yourself," the captain said. With those final words, the crew departed, leaving David behind. They wouldn't be back for another year. Once they were gone, David began to settle into the cabin. Later that night, he discovered a diary in a drawer that belonged to Robert, the previous weather officer. The diary was filled with observations about the island, including cryptic mentions of a mysterious creature. However, the entries were vague and incomplete. David read through every line meticulously. He found sketches of strange, otherworldly animals scattered throughout the pages. David couldn't wrap his head around why Robert would draw such things. He figured the man was probably just lonely and doing it to pass the time. On one of the pages, there was a photograph of the former officer's wife. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with him, and David drifted off to sleep while reading. The next morning, David began his routine of collecting weather data, but as he approached the shore, he froze. He noticed stones arranged in a bizarre fashion among the rocks, with seashells placed carefully between them in a strange pattern. David shrugged it off, assuming it was Gruner's doing, and got back to work. That night, while David was busy with his task, there was a sudden knock at the door. He paused, thinking it was probably just Gruner. David called out his name, but there was no response. As he approached the door with the lamp in hand, a strange sound began to echo in his ears, a sound that was definitely not human. Suddenly, he saw a grotesque, otherworldly hand trying to claw its way inside from under the door. It didn't look like a human hand at all. Terrified, David bolted toward the basement and scrambled into a hiding spot. Within moments, the mysterious creature had broken into the house. It began prowling through the shadows, searching for him. David watched through a small crack in the floorboards, his heart pounding. A slight movement gave him away, and the creature spotted him. It lunged toward the basement, shrieking, and tried to grab him through the gap. In a desperate act of self-defense, David grabbed a knife and stabbed the creature in the eye. It let out a piercing scream and fled into the night. David didn't sleep a wink. He realized with chilling certainty that the entries in Robert's diary were true. The next morning, David ventured outside and found tracks in the sand, prints that were far from human. They led directly into the ocean and vanished. It all clicked. He finally understood why Gruner had barricaded the lighthouse with sharp stakes. He knew right then that if he stayed in that house, those creatures would eventually kill him. The tension is really building up. Paralyzed by fear, David ran toward the lighthouse, screaming at Gruner, "Open the gate, let me in." But Gruner refused to budge, coldly replying, "You should have left with the ship." Dejected, David retreated to the cabin. He realized he was on his own now and had to take matters into his own hands. He began boarding up every window with timber and built a perimeter of sharp wooden stakes around the house. Outside the main door, he piled up old papers and books, dousing them in oil, a makeshift trap to fend off the creatures with fire if they returned. Fortunately, he discovered an old crate inside the house containing a shotgun and a stash of ammunition. Seeing the weapon gave him a flicker of hope that he might actually survive. Night fell quickly. David sat silently in a corner, clutching the gun, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, the sound started. He peered through a gap in the window toward the ocean and saw a nightmare unfolding. It wasn't just one, dozens of those creatures were emerging from the water, crawling toward him. Within moments, they swarmed the cabin, throwing themselves against the door to break it down. David immediately opened fire, gunning down several creatures. He expected the rest to scatter in fear, but seeing their kind fall only made them more aggressive. Realizing he was being overrun, David ignited the oil-soaked papers outside. As the flames roared to life, the creatures recoiled in terror and retreated back into the depths of the ocean. But now, the very fire David had started began to consume his home. The wooden door caught fire, and the flames spread rapidly through the old timber structure. David quickly wrapped himself in a blanket, narrowly escaping the burning house, and scrambled to hide behind a massive boulder near the lighthouse. Suddenly, a heavy downpour began. While the rain eventually extinguished the flames, it was too late. By morning, David's home was nothing but a charred ruin. He realized that if he wanted to survive, seeking refuge in the lighthouse was his only option. Clutching his rifle, David hid among the rocks near the lighthouse, waiting for Gruner to emerge for his water run. As soon as Gruner stepped outside, David began to tail him. But out of nowhere, a strange creature lunged at David. He managed to wrestle it into submission and was just about to pull the trigger when Gruner shouted, "Stop! Don't shoot! She's mine, she's a pet." David lowered his gun but didn't let his guard down. Seizing the moment, he used the creature's life as leverage and gave Gruner an ultimatum. "If you want to keep this creature alive, let me into the lighthouse," David demanded. "Otherwise, I'll kill it." Gruner finally relented, realizing that David also possessed a valuable stockpile of food and ammunition. Before sunset, the two of them hauled the remaining supplies into the lighthouse and settled in for the night. The next morning, David woke up to find the creature quietly licking his hand. To his absolute shock, he realized the wound on his hand had completely healed. Her saliva had miraculous healing properties. David was stunned. He became obsessed with learning more about the species, realizing this discovery was nothing short of a miracle. He envisioned bringing this secret to the world. He and Gruner could earn fame and a massive fortune. However, Gruner had no interest in wealth or the outside world. He refused to leave the island. To him, this place was perfect, a remote kingdom where he was the sole ruler, answering to no one. David couldn't wrap his head around how such a wild creature had become so loyal. Gruner eventually revealed the truth. He had saved her life once, and she had stayed by his side ever since. She had accidentally gotten tangled in his fishing net when she was just a juvenile. Since that day, she stayed with Gruner and began to obey his every command. But Gruner was a cruel and hardened man. He treated the creature despicably. He was using the creature for physical gratification, which was the real reason the others emerged from the ocean every night. They were trying to rescue one of their own. Gruner, however, would never let her go. Fortunately for him, the creatures couldn't attack during the day because they couldn't withstand direct sunlight. By now, David wanted nothing more than to escape this island. As evening approached, Gruner ordered him to grab his gun and get ready. They could attack at any moment, he warned. The lighthouse beacon was switched on, and within minutes, a massive swarm of creatures emerged from the sea, advancing steadily toward the lighthouse. Gruner opened fire relentlessly, but David was paralyzed by sheer terror. Despite Gruner's repeated shouts for help, David remained huddled in the corner until he eventually fainted from the stress. Gruner spent the entire night fighting them off alone. The next morning, a furious Gruner woke David by splashing water in his face. "If you want to stay alive," he growled, "you're going to have to start killing them. Otherwise," Gruner threatened, "I'll kick you out of the lighthouse. From now on, you do exactly as I say. You'll fetch the water, handle the chores, and fight those things by my side every single night." David had no other choice. Submission was his only means of survival. He began following Gruner's every command, though he remained disgusted by the way Gruner physically tortured the female creature day after day. When night fell again, they prepared for the next assault. As the creatures emerged from the depths, David felt a shift. The paralyzing fear was gone. He began firing into the swarm. But tonight, Gruner did nothing. To force David to learn how to survive on his own, Gruner locked the lighthouse door, leaving David outside to face the horde alone while he sat safely inside. David fought relentlessly until dawn. When Gruner finally opened the door the next morning, he found David sitting against the entrance, drenched in blood but alive. David had finally learned how to kill. As time passed, this grueling routine became his life. Fighting off monsters by night and serving as Gruner's laborer by day, the island, once a place of isolation, began to feel like his twisted version of home. Over time, David developed an unusual bond with the female creature. He began to feel a deep sense of empathy for her, finally understanding the agonizing weight of being isolated from one's own kind. He even gave her a name, Anarius. As the days turned into weeks, they noticed the nightly attacks were gradually tapering off. David assumed the creatures had finally realized that fighting them was a lost cause, but Gruner disagreed. "That's not it at all," he warned. "They'll be back. Right now, they're just gathering their strength and growing their numbers." One evening after dinner, Gruner and David sat down for a game of chess to pass the time. It was then that Gruner made a catastrophic mistake. Both men became so engrossed in the game that they completely forgot to switch on the lighthouse beacon. Using the shroud of darkness to their advantage, the creatures launched a massive surprise assault. David realized with horror that the sheer size of the swarm was overwhelming, far too many for just 2 men to handle. As their ammunition began to dwindle, they scrambled to the top of the lighthouse, barely escaping with their lives. During the chaos, Gruner sustained a severe injury to his leg. The creatures had the upper hand, and both men were certain that this was the end. But just as hope seemed lost, the sun began to rise. Unable to endure the light, the creatures retreated from the lighthouse and vanished back into the sea. By now, it had become clear to David that this was a war they could not win. Their food supplies were dwindling, and they wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. A few more days passed, and Gruner's behavior toward both David and Anarius remained as wretched as ever. He was particularly violent toward Anarius, which David found increasingly unbearable. One day, David gifted Anarius a small toy boat he had carved out of a fishbone. When Anarius saw the gift, she led David to a hidden corner of the island where an actual, full-sized boat was stashed away. When David confronted Gruner about it, Gruner admitted he had known about the boat all along. He explained that some people had once reached the island by boat, seeking refuge. However, not a single soul survived until morning. The creatures had slaughtered them all. They had been transporting explosives and ammunition, but their ship went down near the island during a massive storm. Hearing this, a plan began to take shape in David's mind. They had an old diving suit in their possession, and he knew exactly how to use it. David suggested that if one of them wore the diving suit and went down to the wreckage of the ship, they might find ammunition or dynamite that could turn the tide against the creatures. Surprisingly, Gruner agreed. He told David, "Fine. You go down in the suit, and I'll haul you back up to the boat." However, Gruner had his own hidden agenda. They took the boat out to the spot where the ship had gone down. David donned the heavy diving suit and descended into the depths. Below, he found the ship completely destroyed, but luck was on his side. He managed to locate several crates of dynamite. Suddenly, a few creatures appeared right in front of him. Panic-stricken, David stumbled and fell. The diving suit was so heavy he couldn't even move, let alone signal Gruner to pull him up. Above, Gruner assumed the creatures had already finished David off. In reality, the creatures David encountered were just 2 small juveniles. Struggling for his life, David managed to shed the heavy diving suit and swim back to the surface on his own. They recovered the old crates containing the dynamite and immediately got to work on their next move. They laid 2 layers of dynamite around the lighthouse perimeter, planning to wipe out the creatures in one massive blast during the next attack. Months passed, and the winter snow began to fall. Once again, the creatures vanished. The attack stopped abruptly. Gruner, convinced that Anarius had somehow warned her kind, began to take his rage out on her, but David stepped in and stopped him. Eventually, the two came up with a new, daring plan. They would leave the main gate of the lighthouse wide open to lure the creatures in, then blow them all to Kingdom Come. David played it smart. He instructed Anarius to scream from the top of the lighthouse. Hearing her cries, the creatures were provoked into a frenzied rage. Seeing the open gate, the swarm thought this was their best chance to rescue Anarius. In reality, they were walking straight into a death trap. Within moments, the creatures emerged from the sea and stormed toward the entrance. As they burst inside, they lunged at David, but he showed incredible courage, fighting them off and narrowly escaping their clutches. Once the entire swarm was positioned exactly where they wanted them, Gruner slammed down the lever to detonate the dynamite. But nothing happened. There was no blast. The wire to the dynamite had come loose. Without a second thought, David rushed up to reconnect it while Gruner stood his ground alone, fighting off the creatures as they swarmed the lighthouse walls. The moment the connection was secure, David detonated the first layer. A massive explosion ripped through the air, obliterating dozens of creatures instantly. However, a second wave was already closing in, ready to breach the lighthouse. Seeing no other choice, Gruner detonated the second layer. The force of the blast was so powerful that both men were knocked unconscious. When they came to the next morning, Anarius was nowhere to be found. The ground was littered with the charred remains of the creatures. Gruner walked among the debris, coldly finishing off any that were still wounded and clinging to life. Seeing the creatures writhing in pain, David was suddenly struck with a wave of pity and a crushing realization of his own mistake. These beings, whom they had viewed as nothing but bloodthirsty monsters, were just like humans, they simply couldn't speak. To Gruner, these thoughts were nonsense. After that night, the attacks stopped forever. But the silence was replaced by a haunting sound. Every night, the sound of weeping would drift from the shoreline. The next day, David looked out at the ocean and saw several small juveniles, children who had lost their entire families in the blast. David arranged a circle of stones on the shore and placed the small toy boat in the center, hoping it would lure Nereus back. He waited for hours, but she never returned. The next morning, David woke up to find Gruner still asleep. Beside him lay some old belongings, including a weathered photograph. When David looked at the picture, he froze in shock. The woman in the photo, the same woman he had seen in the former officer Robert's diary, was Gruner's wife. And standing right next to her in the photo was Gruner himself. The truth finally hit him. Robert, the weather officer who arrived a year ago, hadn't died. He had simply changed his identity. Gruner was Robert. He had reinvented himself because he never intended to leave the island. Realizing this, David felt a wave of despair, losing all hope that he would ever be able to leave this place. The following evening, David walked down to the shore. He noticed the toy boat was gone from the stone circle. In its place stood a small juvenile creature, clutching the boat in its tiny hands. To show he meant no harm and had no intention of fighting, David tossed his burning torch into the center of the circle. He didn't want them to feel threatened. He wanted to find a way to coexist. He wanted to be their friend. A few moments later, Nereus emerged from the waves, followed by the entire colony of creatures. This time, however, no one attacked David. They too wanted peace. Their only goal was to find a safe haven for their young. But the silence was shattered when Gruner arrived, clutching his rifle. To Gruner, peace was a threat. If the conflict ended, he would lose the sense of absolute power that made him feel superior. David tried to reason with him, pleading that the creatures no longer wanted to fight. Gruner wouldn't hear it. He barked at Nereus, ordering her to get back inside. For the first time, Nereus defied him. She was no longer his servant. Feeling his control slip away, Gruner became desperate and unhinged. In a fit of rage, he opened fire. The bullet struck one of the juveniles, killing it instantly. Terrified, the creatures scattered into the darkness. In that single moment, Nereus lost all faith in David. Consumed by fury, David charged toward the lighthouse to make Gruner pay. A brutal struggle broke out between them. Gruner, now completely homicidal, decided to end David's life. Just as he swung a heavy iron rod to deliver the killing blow, David screamed out his real name, Robert. The sound of his true identity hit Gruner like a physical blow, and he froze instantly. The truth was, Robert had never been a monster. The isolation of the island had shattered his mental health. The crushing loneliness, the death of his wife, and a deep, spiraling depression had twisted him into the man he became. At his core, he wasn't a killer, he had been a good man. Overcome by the weight of his actions, Gruner finally realized what he had done. He walked out and surrendered himself to the creatures, who killed him within moments. David retreated into the lighthouse and locked himself inside. Time slipped away. A year later, a government official arrived on the island, accompanied by a new weather officer assigned to take over the post. When the captain questioned David about the previous officer, David gave the same chilling reply. He headed toward the water one day and never came back. The newcomers looked at David, assuming he was Gruner the wild, hardened man who had lived there for years. David didn't bother to correct them. He walked out onto the balcony and stood there in silence, staring at the horizon. He realized now that he, too, never wanted to leave this island.